This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 826 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I wanted to send another reminder about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. I know I talk about buys and sells on this show every week, but sometimes you might not know exactly where I'm placing these guys rest of season. Well, with the Patreon, you can get my rest of season rankings and tiers. I think there's more to it than just looking at a set of rankings, but it's at least a good starting point. There's also live Q&As, weekly rankings and tiers, and more on the Patreon. You can learn more over on lateround.com. Add Will Levis. So Will Levis made his debut for the Titans on Sunday, and it went really well. He ended up throwing 4 touchdown passes on 29 attempts. Now, I don't do a lot of quarterback prospecting because it's really hard. I don't have a model for it. I have some takes on who I think is going to be good and who I think is not going to be good, but those takes are not nearly as strong as they are running back, wide receiver, and even tight end. If you talk to analysts around the draft community, the majority of analysts pre-draft did not like Will Levis. But we have to keep an open mind. We're wrong all the time. Not just me, not just other analysts, but fans are too. What if Will Levis is just a lot better than people thought? What if his physical tools really do translate? We still don't have an answer to that. We don't know for sure if Levis is going to be good. We've only seen him play in one game. And in that one game, he had a really unsustainable touchdown rate. I can guarantee you right now that he's not going to finish with a 13 or 14% touchdown rate rest of season. That's just not going to happen. And I would be pretty surprised if he ends up being this week in and week out starter for your fantasy team. Rookie quarterbacks generally aren't reaching that status. But the quarterback position is kind of rough right now in fantasy football. And Will Levis is sitting on your waiver wire. He's not costing a lot to acquire. So why not? Why not see if there's more to this? You probably don't need to add Levis in shallower leagues, but if you're in a 12, 14 team league, I think that he's worth rostering just to see what this is all about. And it doesn't hurt that Tennessee has the 6th best quarterback schedule from here on out, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers. Hold or sell DeAndre Hopkins. So the biggest winner from Will Levis's big Week 8 performance, definitely DeAndre Hopkins. He finally found the end zone for Tennessee. And he didn't do it once. He didn't do it twice. He did it 3 times. He had 34.8 PPR points. That was his best outing of the year by far. But here's the thing. His target share, just 22.2%. That was actually his second lowest target share of the season. If there's anyone in your league who right now is willing to buy into this Tennessee passing attack, I'm talking like really buy into it, then Hopkins is an obvious sell to that team. A 22% target share in this Tennessee offense is not going to lead to a lot of opportunity. We even saw that against Atlanta. Hopkins only had 6 targets. This is a run-heavy offense. And even though we liked what we saw out of Levis in Week 8, we can't assume that the Titans are going to stray away from their ground and pound approach. They had a 47% pass rate against Atlanta. That's not high at all. The thing is, chances are the managers in your league, they're not ready to just buy into Will Levis. They're not ready to buy into this passing attack. That's why I think Hopkins is probably more of a hold than a sell. The Titans also have a top 10 wide receiver schedule from here on out. But just keep all of this context in mind. Tennessee still was not pass heavy this past week. DeAndre Hopkins didn't see like a 35-40% target share. It could be an upgrade. This could be a good thing for Hopkins down the line. But let's not assume that he can be a wide receiver 1 from here on out. Buy Brandon Ayuk. The 49ers have now lost 3 straight games. There are some bad vibes surrounding that San Francisco passing attack. And Brandon Ayuk, the team's top receiver, he's been good but not great during this time. He really hasn't had a monster game since Week 4. And that's despite the fact that Deebo Samuel's been sidelined. That could be a frustrating thing for fantasy managers. And now the 49ers have a bye. So those same Ayuk managers, the ones who have been a little bit frustrated with how he's performed without Deebo Samuel, they might be trying to win right now. They need a win in week 9. There are instances where players are easier to acquire when they're on their bye. And I would be willing to take on Ayuk. He's sitting with a 24% target share in the season, and he's been at or above a 25% target share in all but one game this year. And after the bye, the 49ers have an awesome wide receiver schedule. It's the second easiest schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from here on out. And in the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, they get the Cardinals, Ravens, and Commanders. Now, Baltimore's not a great matchup, but Arizona's a +1, and Washington is the best one for wide receivers in adjusted points allowed. Add Trey McBride. So I talked about McBride on a couple of episodes last week on the podcast. Hopefully you were able to get him rostered. But we need to talk about his workload in week 8 because it was amazing. Without Zach Ertz in that lineup, McBride played 83% of Arizona's offensive snaps. His previous season high was 58%. More importantly, he had a 38.9% target share. 38.9%. Pre-Monday Night Football, so Sam Laporta might get there, maybe Michael Mayer gets there. I have no idea. I'm recording this before Monday Night Football. But pre-Monday Night Football, that 38.9% target share, that's the highest from any tight end in a single game this season. Trey McBride needs to be rostered in 100% of leagues. Add Khalil Shakir. So for those of you who have listened to this podcast for about a year and a half now, maybe 2 years, you know that my prospect model and me, that we like Khalil Shakir. And so far, that hasn't looked that great. He hasn't been a consistent contributor in the NFL yet. But over the last 2 weeks, he started seeing more work in this Buffalo offense. Back in week 7, he had a season high in route participation at 42.9%. That was far, far higher than his previous high of 17.9%. And then in week 8, that number went up again to 73.8%. That resulted in a 15% target share and 92 receiving yards on 6 catches. Remember, Dawson Knox is out of the lineup for Buffalo. That should force a lot more 11 personnel for this Bills offense, or 3 wide receiver sets. In that type of personnel, Khalil Shakir can be their slot guy. And in such a high-powered passing attack, that can be usable in fantasy football. Sell Gabe Davis. So just because Khalil Shakir makes sense off the waiver wire doesn't mean that we've got to love every Bills player or every Bills wide receiver. Gabe Davis is coming off a huge game against Tampa Bay. He scored 23.7 PPR points. He had a 31% target share. The thing is, both of those numbers, season highs. His target share has actually been above 14% just 3 times this year. That's the obvious reason to sell. He's not giving you consistent production. Nothing's really changed with Davis. He's a big play receiver who's capable of these spiked weeks. But the consistency is unlikely to be there. And that's a big turnoff for fantasy managers. It's frustrating on my end too. It's hard to project a player like this. But on top of that, Buffalo's wide receiver schedule is 5th worst by adjusted fantasy points allowed from now through the end of the year. So I think right now, you can sell Gabe Davis. Add Quentin Johnston. Like I said earlier with Will Levis, don't be overconfident in your own ability to prospect players. This is a game about probability. We can sit here and say that Quentin Johnston is a volatile prospect. That's what I said this offseason. I had a take on Quentin Johnston. I thought there was a lot of volatility to his profile. So we can sit here and say that we like Johnston a little bit less than consensus. Just don't let those thoughts take over. Understand that there's still an out here for Quentin Johnston to be usable in fantasy football. Look at the offense that he's in. When young players, especially first-round wide receivers, when they see an uptick in usage and production, you need to react. And in week 8, Johnston had a season-high 15.8% target share. He played a season-high 69% of LA's snaps. Now, some of this might just be the result of Josh Palmer being banged up. He wasn't 100% healthy in that game. But this could also be natural progression. Historically, rookie wide receivers, they do a lot better during the second half of their rookie season than the first. And he's in one of the better passing attacks in football. Why not throw a dart at Quentin Johnston right now? Buy Chris Olave. This is one of those on-paper recommendations that's probably a little bit riskier than it seems. Because on paper, Chris Olave is a very, very obvious buy candidate. He's currently underperforming in expected fantasy points per game by roughly 4.5 PPR points. He's seen a 26.6% target share per game rate, and he's been north of a 30% target share in 4 games this year. Only A.J. Brown has more air yards this season than Chris Olave, and he's leading him by 2 yards. Like I said, on paper, Chris Olave is a very obvious buy candidate. He just isn't converting right now. Now, if you're a believer that it's the offense or that Olave himself just isn't that good of a player, then you can ignore this transaction. But my model saw Chris Olave as not only an elite prospect, but an elite player entering year 2. His year 2 model score was very, very good. And I'm almost always going to lean into that. Sell Gus Edwards. So selling Gus Edwards this week, not as straightforward as you might think. Over his last 2 games, Edwards has seen his highest running back rush share rates of the entire season. Against Detroit 2 weeks ago, he had a 78% running back rush share. This past week against Arizona, 83%. That's what makes this a little bit tough. But with that being said, Edwards hasn't seen huge spikes in snap share. He was at 57% in week 8. That's right in line with where he's been at throughout the season. And his target share, it's still really low. He hasn't been a pass catcher. He's had a target share per game of just 3.7% over his last 4. But Edwards has scored 21 and 29 PPR points over his last 2 games, respectively. That's really come down to touchdowns and unsustainable plays, though. Week 7, he had that 80-yard reception. He had 1 target, and he had 80 yards on that target. And then week 8, he had 3 rushing touchdowns. Maybe moving forward, he sees a higher proportion of those goal line looks. He's already starting to see that. But you guys know my process. It's really hard for me to buy into early down players, non-pass catching running backs, who aren't even hitting a 60% snap rate. Those are just not the type of running backs that I want to invest in. So I do think that Gus Edwards is a sell. Add Michael Wilson. So Michael Wilson hasn't done anything really great since his big week 4 blow up against the 49ers. But he's playing a lot of snaps and he's running a lot of routes. And yeah, we could say that about a lot of players. There's a lot of wide receivers out there just getting cardio every week. But not all those players are rookies. And not all those players are seeing a potential upgrade at quarterback like Michael Wilson might see. We don't know exactly when Kyler Murray is going to be back and under center for Arizona. What we do know is that he's been an effective quarterback in the past. And like I said with Quentin Johnston, you want these rookie wide receivers during the second half of their rookie year. So I do think that Michael Wilson, as a result, is a reasonable stash. Hold James Cook. So Leonard Fournette signed with the Bills on Monday. And I got a lot of questions about Fournette and his impact on this backfield. So I figured I'd talk about it on this 15 transaction show. The natural reaction to something like this is that we want nothing to do with this team's existing starter. In this case, that's James Cook. And while I do think that this signing does have a chance to impact Cook, I would not be selling low. Damian Harris is on IR. He's been on IR for 2 full games. During those 2 games, James Cook has seen running back rush shares of 76.5% and 73.7%. He was more in that 50% to 60% range pre-injury. So hypothetically, if Leonard Fournette's able to take on Damian Harris's role, where he sort of splits that RB2 role with Latavius Murray, that could lower James Cook's rush attempts, maybe by 2 or 3 rushes. That's not nothing. But his biggest issue, James Cook's biggest issue, has been his target share. He's averaged a 3.4% target share per game over his last 3. That number was 10.3% during his first 5. That's a problem. The good news, though, his route participation has not changed that much. So to me, that might just be variance more than anything else. We're probably in store for James Cook to see some regression in his target share number. I think in the end that Latavius Murray is the bigger loser with this move of signing Leonard Fournette. He's averaged a running back rush share of 31% over his last 3 games, but he's had very little to show for it. During this time, he's failed to convert his 6 rushes within the opponent's 10-yard line into a single touchdown. Latavius Murray has not been very good over the last month. So to me, Cook may end up seeing a little bit of a dip in his backfield share. That's if Fournette surpasses Murray on the depth chart, which is very possible. Cook, though, should still be the team's top running back and fantasy producer. There's no need to panic sell. It's going to probably take some time for Fournette to ramp up anyway. And I guess if you're in a deep enough league, you could add Leonard Fournette this week too. Buy DK Metcalf. We haven't seen a really huge week from DK Metcalf all season long. He's played 6 games, and the highest that he's ranked in weekly scoring is wide receiver 18. That's in PPR formats. He's had a really nice PPR floor. He scored no fewer than 10.9 points in a game, but his ceiling has been 17.2. Now, a problem that Metcalf had last year was that he couldn't find the end zone. He scored 6 times when Pro Football Focus's expected touchdowns model had him listed at 10.5. He underperformed the touchdown column by a pretty wide margin. And here in 2023, the same exact thing is happening. Metcalf has scored twice in 6 games. His expected touchdown total is 4. He's also coming off a pretty mediocre performance within the context of how that team performed. Tyler Lockett and Jackson Smith-Njigba both scored touchdowns against the Browns. DK Metcalf didn't. But he did have a 38.9% target share, and that was by far his highest of the season. That's really good news for his future production. Regression should hit for DK Metcalf. And that's a really good thing when you consider his fantasy playoff schedule. Listen to this, guys. During weeks 15 through 17, Seattle gets the Eagles, the second best matchup in adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers, the Titans, who are the 4th best matchup, and the Steelers, who are currently the 3rd best matchup. It is by far the best stretch of matchups during the fantasy playoffs for wide receivers. Now might be the perfect time to buy DK Metcalf. Add Jayden Reed. So in week 8, Jayden Reed ran a route on 89% of Jordan Love's dropbacks. Not only was that his highest route participation of the season, his previous high was 75.6%, but it was the highest on the Packers. That's noteworthy. Reed finished the day against Minnesota with a 15% target share and 12.3 PPR points. Now, I know the Packers have been horrible offensively of late, but they do have a very favorable passing schedule upcoming. So Jayden Reed should be rostered. Buy Tee Higgins. It's been a really strange season for this Bengals offense, and it's been even weirder for Tee Higgins. Higgins was healthy earlier this season during a stretch of time where Joe Burrow wasn't. The entire Bengals offense could not get going because Joe Burrow was not 100%. They scored 3 offensive touchdowns across their first 4 games of the season. And that led to some miserable performances from Tee Higgins. Higgins then missed week 5. And in Cincinnati's week 6 game, he split time with Trenton Irwin. During that 2-game stretch, the Bengals offense started to come alive. They scored 5 touchdowns. They looked more like the Bengals that we expected to start the year. So essentially, Tee Higgins is healthy to start the year, but Joe Burrow wasn't. Joe Burrow starts to get healthy, and Tee Higgins hasn't been healthy. Now, after a week 7 bye, Higgins got a more legitimate shot to produce in week 8. He got the good Bengals offense. But he likely wasn't yet 100% because he still played behind Tyler Boyd. But Higgins did play more snaps than the last time that we saw him. And it was in a game where Cincinnati played with a decent positive game script. That could explain some of this. That could explain why he played behind Tyler Boyd. They didn't want to risk anything. But even still, Higgins finished with a respectable 18.8% target share. He ranked 2nd on the team in targets. I just don't think that Higgins has really had a fair shot this year. And he's one of the biggest underachievers in expected fantasy points scored. That's a clear sign of regression. And the Bengals also have one of the better wide receiver schedules from here on out according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. So just like DK Metcalf, I think right now could be the perfect time to buy Tee Higgins. Add the Atlanta Falcons defense. Now I know the Falcons did not come through last week against Will Levis. He tore them apart. But I think the process for the Atlanta defense was still right. It was still fair. And it's a similar process this week. Kirk Cousins tore his Achilles. He's done for the year. It's looking like 5th rounder Jaren Hall is going to start for Minnesota this week. Nick Mullins, another option for them, is currently on IR. That's why FanDuel Sportsbook has this Vikings-Falcons game with a 37.5 point over-under, and the Falcons are 4.5 point favorites. Now, I know that Atlanta got burned by one rookie quarterback last week. Surely it's not going to happen to an inferior option this week, right? Right? I do think process-wise, this Atlanta defense makes sense in week 9. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.